This is my grandmother. She's a tough, thick-skinned, 88-year-old machine of a human being who resides here, in a humble little village on the outskirts of Anqing in Anhui, China. This has been her home her entire life, all the way from the 1930s during the dawn of the Japanese onslaught into central and southern China, to the inception of communist rule in 1949, all the way to the horrors of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, to the digital age of today. To me, she's quite the enigma. If you asked me what her idiosyncrasies were, I couldn't tell you. If you asked me what her hobbies were, I couldn't tell you. The only thing I knew up until this point was that she was extremely hard of hearing and she was recently hospitalized for an acute condition. When she was eventually discharged, my family suggested for my grandmother to move in with my uncle so that my uncle could take care of her on a more daily basis. And my uncle did tell me that she did not enjoy that experience whatsoever. She would drone on and on about wanting to return to her village, especially when they were at dinner time when my uncle did cook food for her. And eventually, after a week, he couldn't take it anymore and he sent her back to her village. Apparently, there was immediate relief. The color came back to my grandmother's face, and that, to me, didn't quite make sense. You know, as a kid who grew up in a very metropolitan area, I never experienced lifestyle in the countryside before, I couldn't quite put my finger on why my grandmother made that decision. This is a story of perspectives, specifically how cultural factors change human perceptions around something as ubiquitous as aging. Regrettably, I never developed a deep sense of empathy with my grandparents back in China, let alone senior members of my community. And that's something that I really want to address and bring awareness to after embarking on this journey. So in April, we decided on a trip back to China over the summer so that I could get to know my grandmother a little bit better and understand her situation. Before the trip, the terms retirement home, assisted living, nursing home, retirement apartments, they didn't make much sense to me. I may have heard about them through chatting with friends or teachers, but if you asked me what the differences were between those options, I couldn't tell you. So to remedy that and hopefully make more better informed decisions on behalf of my grandmother, when I did go back to China, I ended up volunteering at a local retirement home. Here is the journal that I documented during my volunteering experience at the local retirement home. And overall, I had pretty positive feelings and first impressions about the place, which is quite against the idea that, senior care is supposed to be really morbid and not approachable by younger generations like me. Like when I first entered the room, I thought the place was well taken care of, the hygiene was really good, you could hear the Beatles music that was just going around in the background. There was a certain quaintness to the place that I really enjoyed, and I couldn't imagine myself ever hating it during my volunteering.
To think I can get up in the morning, have my breakfast and open up the blinds and the door and look outside and see the sunshine and know that everything seems to be going fine. They're, for the most part, they're all very caring here, and they keep such a wonderful place, and everything in here is spotless. So it is a very nice place to be.
And I think it's interesting that this is also quite against what I expected, is that in general, the residents felt quite comfortable living there, even though it was relatively expensive, which I will get into a little bit later. But they had no complaints, pretty much, other than sometimes the food was not on par with their tastes, but once again, food is something that you can't make everybody happy about.
My husband had dementia, and while he was in the home, he was going to have his 100th birthday, so I booked the area that they held special events in, and they did the catering for the food, which I paid for, of course, and his Legion Branch 44, they wanted to bring the birthday cake, and there was 38 people came to his birthday, and of course he hadn't talked in a couple of years at all, just smiled at everybody. So we started singing happy birthday to my husband, and I was standing right beside his chair, and all of a sudden I look at him and he's got this big smile on his face, and out loud he's singing happy birthday, and he hadn't talked in 2 years. And we were so shocked, the rest of us, we almost quit singing, and then we realized, oh, what are we doing? And that my husband sang happy birthday to himself on his 100th birthday, and he never talked again after. And about 5 weeks after his 100th birthday, I got a call one morning about 8 o'clock from the nurse, one of the nurses, and she's crying. And she said, I went in to wake Howard up this morning, and she said I was holding his hand, and she said, saying, you're going to get up, Howard? And she said, he had a smile on his face, and she said he had a hold of my hand, and she said he passed away with me holding his hand. She's crying her eyes out. Often wondered she ever got over it. She was so upset. But that's the only experience I've had of a family member in a care home.
There are a few things that I would like to point out, some things that I wrote down. This was during an interview I had with the receptionist who worked there for the past 5 years or so. And we had a conversation about something that was across the street, which was that I volunteered at a retirement home, but across the street was a nursing home for seniors who were very much dependent on 24-hour care with nurses. And this is what she said. When I brought up the building across the street, she winced. Quote, I was offered a job there, but the place is way too depressing. There's no independence, the doors are locked, and it really is depressing. I did it for a week and I quit. And upon hearing that, I was quite inquisitive, thinking, what is it about some of these assisted living facilities, and especially nursing homes, that make them so grim? And also here, this is part of some of my interviews with a gentleman named Don.
The people there can't be any more nicer to her than I would be, but this, it's not the same.
And I got some insights into his life with his wife. So his wife unfortunately has mild dementia, which is getting worse, but however, because she does have this condition that is diagnosed, she cannot live in a retirement home and has to live in the nursing home across the street where she has 24-hour support.
It's definitely not as rich as this side of the street. They have to rely on people's generosity to survive, I think, over there. They often have, sales of clothing and different things in order to make ends meet. But I mean, my money obviously is helping them support the rest of the building. it cost me $11,000, over $11,000 a month for the two residences. So.
I went into the front driveway and took a peek inside the lovely building. It was quite the contrary on the inside. The first thing I noticed was that there were iron bars that were blocking the reception desk from the rest of the rooms. And I didn't look further enough to see any residents inside, but without context, you could really imagine it to be some sort of a prison. Living in a rural, dilapidated countryside in southeastern China in the height of summer, it was quite the experience. Although I had visited my grandmother's home as a 6-year-old for Chinese New Year, I never appreciated both the beauty and utter brutality that was living a rural lifestyle. And moving further away from the freeway, you start to see endless rice paddies stretching to rolling hills and mountains. It's just something that you don't get to experience in a place like the bigger cities. But other than that, everything else was pretty brutal. The lifestyle was extremely demanding, and though there was a small village center with some shops, produce is rarely stocked because everybody just grows their own stuff. I remember the one thing I appreciated the most was how villagers would carry buckets of waste products from the outdoor washrooms down to the fields as organic fertilizer. And when you pair that with a sun that was beating down at just under 40 degrees Celsius, I really don't know how people like my grandmother were able to sustain this lifestyle. I would love to say that I powered through all of these tasks, that I fulfilled everything I planned on that notebook, but my scrawny, metropolized self just couldn't handle the combination of the intense heat and all the pressure that I put myself beforehand, because on the second day, I promptly caught the flu and had a debilitating fever for the next week. So, in a very distinct way, the entire script flipped. My plan was to take care of my grandmother when I went back to China. However, she ended up taking care of me and completely humbling me in every single way possible. While reflecting on this topic, it brings quite a sense of melancholy to me to think that, one day my grandmother's going to lose this independence. She's going to lose the ability to be able to take care of her loved ones, which has kept her going all of these years. And when that day comes, because it's so hard for us to be able to connect with her back in China, the most likely scenario is that she eventually will have to rely on some sort of care institution in order for her to survive. And that's just not a very ideal situation in a place like China, which I still didn't know about up till this point, but a week later, we got the chance to not only visit some of these institutions, but also get to interact with an individual that rejected these institutions because they thought it was not humane for them to spend the rest of their life in some of these places. This is my grandaunt, suffering from the late stages of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. She has no voluntary control of her muscles, and she relies on the full-time care of my granduncle. I was frozen still, never having come across somebody so vulnerable. She was just laying there on the hospital bed, sort of staring into my eyes, even though there wasn't much looking, if that makes any sense at all. But I couldn't meet the gaze for long. I tried to communicate as best as I can, telling her that 你好，我是纪元，我是春霞的儿子, which means that, hello, I'm Jerry, I'm my mom's son. And that didn't last long, whatever, and I felt so stuck in that moment. I was sinking deeper and deeper into the couch, and finally, my granduncle eventually entered the room and saved the whole situation. It was time to feed my grandaunt, and he sat her up so that their eyes eventually met, and he was gently caressing her arm and brushing the tangles in her short wispy hair. It was a moment that I couldn't quite describe, and I can't really put my finger on it now that I'm talking about it to you. But it's a level of beauty that you really couldn't see in an institutionalized care facility. And that's something that these care facilities should strive to achieve as much as possible, to have this deep emotional connection. Because when my granduncle eventually did start feeding my grandaunt, there was a twinkle in her eye that did not happen when I was trying to communicate with her. Unfortunately, not all seniors have this sort of privilege, especially in rural places or in less affluent places in China. You don't have this ability to have family close to you taking care of you 24/7. But the problem is that at a certain point in life, people like my grandmother will eventually reach a point of dependence on family or institutional care. And we need to make these options as best as possible for some of these individuals. As the population ages and as more families are moving outside of these villages into the developed cities to find work, it's a lot harder to be able to go back and take care of their elders. These elders who have lived their lifestyle and cemented their beliefs and worldview in this village. And it's very hard for them to adapt and just transition into city life. And there's not a lot of infrastructure for them either inside the cities, because caretaking, unfortunately, is quite taboo in a place like China, especially rural China. Whereas in Canada, relatively speaking, caretakers and caregivers are held in relative high regard because we need them so much and we know what value they can bring. But in China, this profession, you can consider it as a relegated profession. They're reserved for people who couldn't get into some of the more top-tier universities, who couldn't find career paths in STEM or in higher levels of doctoring. And this is also reflected in the quality of caretaking. I did end up visiting a lot of the nursing homes in China, especially the ones that my grandaunt actually considered before she decided to just stay at home and had my granduncle take care of her. The atmosphere was completely different. Gone were the droning of just Beatles music in the background. Gone were the shows that were held weekly here in Canada in some of the institutions here. The energy was just not there because everything in China was very grim. Once again, you saw the iron bars that were separating the receptionists from all of the rooms at the end. The nurses didn't have that smile or that warmth that I saw here in Canada. And although I wasn't able to visit some of the rooms, I think this could be translated pretty well into caretaking quality as well. And that's why my grandaunt, a year before she ended up in this situation, did not choose to live inside an institutional care facility like a nursing home or an assisted living facility. Reflecting on the week when I was sick and my grandmother was taking care of me, that was sort of my moment of realization. While I considered my grandmother short-sighted and stubborn, now I'm dreading the day that she loses this independence. It would be absolute torture for her. And unfortunately, not all of us have this gift of full-time family caretaker, and this certainly wouldn't be the case for my grandmother. There isn't adequate infrastructure in places like China to support elders, especially in rural areas, and this generation will suffer the most out of any. But I think something could be done here, and it starts with the awareness of younger generations. It's more important now than ever for people like us to spearhead a sort of cultural shift, especially in places like China where caretaking is looked down upon. And it shouldn't be overlooked in places like Canada either. It starts with having honest conversations with our elders. That way we can understand their perspectives of life. And I think this really ties in all my interactions with seniors over the past year. When I take the time to have these honest conversations with the vulnerable, I can appreciate the rewarding experience of caretaking, and I can make better decisions on behalf of my loved ones when the time comes. I can advocate for a considerate future that bridges the disconnect between the old and the young. From my perspective, I think tomorrow is a dark time for those that are the most vulnerable. and the onus is on us to make it better for them.